Okay, let's unpack this. Thinking about funding for science, it can sometimes feel a bit abstract, right?
Yeah, like it's all happening somewhere else, in labs, universities,
Yeah,
far away.
exactly. But what if those big decisions, the ones about federal budgets, actually hit really close to home, affecting, like, the technology you use every day,
Or your health, the latest treatments.
even national security, potentially?
And that connection, that's exactly what we're diving into today. This whole discussion, it's really prompted by a proposal we've seen, one that suggests potentially sweeping cuts to U.S. federal funding,
Right, across a lot of different areas of science and research.
starting in the next fiscal year, which kicks off October 1st, 2026.
And to help us, get our heads around what this could all mean, we've looked at a couple of really key sources. First up, we've got an analysis from someone prominent in the AI field.
Mm-hmm.
And they argue pretty strongly that cutting fundamental research funding, it actually, well, it weakens a nation.
And we're setting that alongside a detailed report from a science news source. This one really digs into the specifics, the actual proposed budget cuts agency by agency, and also the reactions, which have been quite strong.
Right, from scientists, advocacy groups, that sort of thing.
Exactly.
Okay, so here's the plan, our mission for this deep dive. First, we want to explore that argument. Is open scientific research really a source of national strength?
Not just good for the world, but specifically good for the country doing the research, fueling innovation, creating talent.
We'll pull from that first source, looking at things like Silicon Valley AI examples, the role agencies like NSF and DARPA have played historically.
And we'll get into the nuance there, too. The idea that, okay, maybe openness does benefit others, but the innovator, the one doing the work, often gains the most.
And staying on that cutting edge is key.
Right. We'll maybe contrast the U.S. approach with how openness has worked within, say, China's tech ecosystem.
Okay, then after that.
Then we pivot. We dive into the nitty-gritty of the proposed budget cuts themselves, using that second source, the news report.
The one describing them as massive and unprecedented.
That's the language used, yeah. Especially hitting non-defense discretionary spending, which is where, a lot of this science funding lives.
And we'll look at the administration's reasoning, what they're saying about why these cuts.
Yes, their stated rationale. Focusing on priorities like AI, quantum, but also aiming to end what they call woke science spending.
Okay.
And we'll have to see how that focus lines up with the actual proposed cuts, because the report suggests cuts, even in some areas, they say are priorities.
Interesting. And the reactions, you mentioned those were strong.
Very strong. Science advocacy groups calling it potentially disastrous, a surrender of U.S. leadership. We'll cover that.
And maybe a little bit on the politics, Congress, historical context.
Yeah, the report touches on that, how Congress has reacted to similar things in the past, the whole process.
Got it. So throughout all this, our goal is just to lay out what these sources are telling us, impartially report on the proposals, the arguments, the potential consequences.
Exactly, just distilling the key info for you so you can make sense of what might be happening.
Okay, let's dive in then. Let's start with that first argument. Why is funding open science seen as a source of national strength? Our first source makes a pretty compelling case.
It does. The core idea is, look, even if the research findings are published openly, available to everyone,
Right.
the nation where that research actually happens gets the biggest leg up.
How so? What are the mechanisms there?
The argument points to mainly two things. First, the new knowledge just spreads faster within that country's own ecosystem. Think
Right.
locally.
Yeah.
And second, the research process itself. That's how you create the skilled people, the talent that the nation needs.
Can you give an example? Maybe the AI one you mentioned.
Yeah, perfect example. Think about the roots of deep learning. A lot of that foundational work, the source points out, got crucial early funding from agencies like the National Science Foundation, NSF, or DARPA.
Right, government funding.
Exactly. Usually happening at universities, research centers, mostly in the U.S. But then, crucially, it doesn't stay locked up.
It gets out. Publications, conferences.
People move around. Researchers take jobs at companies, they start their own businesses, they talk to each other.
Especially in places like Silicon Valley, right?
Yeah.
Where everyone's kind of clustered together.
Precisely. You have this dense network, universities, startups, big tech firms, and the knowledge just zips around. Formal channels like papers, yes, but also informal ones, networking, bumping into people.
Like a positive feedback loop.
That's the term the source uses. Funding basic research here primarily benefits the U.S. first and fastest. The ecosystem absorbs it, builds on it, and, importantly, it trains the next wave of innovators who mostly stay here.
So others benefit eventually, but the home country gets the first mover advantage.
That's the argument. Allies benefit too, sure, but the nation doing the innovating gains the most, especially initially.
So, okay, there's a risk, maybe, that adversaries could learn from this open research.
There is. The source acknowledges that, citing a U.S. House subcommittee discussion.
But the argument is the benefits outweigh that risk.
Yes. The benefits to U.S. competitiveness, security from that rapid internal spread and talent creation are seen as so large that the risk of others eventually gaining the knowledge is considered, well, warranted, a necessary trade-off.
Especially in fields moving super fast, like generative AI.
Exactly. The key isn't just having the knowledge from, say, last year's model, it's staying right at the cutting edge.
Like even if someone else catches up to GPT-4.
OpenAI or Google or whoever is already working on GPT-5 or 6 or whatever comes next. The innovators are best placed to commercialize the latest breakthroughs. Being even slightly ahead matters hugely when things change so quickly.
So it's about the process, the continuous innovation, not just a single invention.
That's a great way to put it. And the source contrasts this with China. It describes China's tech ecosystem as very open internally.
Internally. How so?
Well, despite maybe starting behind the U.S. in generative AI, they've caught up incredibly fast. The source suggests this is partly due to big funding for open academic research there, companies releasing open-weight models, and a culture that encourages idea sharing among employees. It creates this really efficient internal circulation of know-how.
Interesting comparison.
And this whole line of thinking, it ties back to something pretty fundamental in U.S. history. Vannevar Bush's 1945 report, Science, the Endless Frontier.
Ah, right. The blueprint for post-war science funding.
Exactly. Many credit that report, its principles of public funding for basic research, with setting up decades of U.S. scientific leadership and training generations of scientists and engineers.
So the concern raised by this first source is what?
It's that after basically inventing and perfecting this incredibly successful model, the U.S. might be starting to back away from it.
Just when global competition is heating up.
Precisely. And that concern leads us directly into our second source, that Science News report detailing these proposed budget cuts.
Okay, let's get into those details. The report uses strong language, massive and unprecedented cuts. What's the overall picture?
Well, the proposal targets the 2026 fiscal year, remember, starting October 26, and it aims for a 23% cut overall in non-defense discretionary spending.
23%. That sounds like a lot. How much money is that?
It works out to about $163 billion. That's the part of the budget funding most civilian agencies, including the bulk of science and research.
And this is happening while other areas are increasing.
The proposal concurrently calls for boosts in defense and homeland security spending, yes.
So what's the administration's stated reason for this big shift, according to the report?
The report indicates the rationale is about resetting priorities, focusing investment on areas deemed crucial for economic and national security. They specifically mention AI, quantum computing, and nuclear energy.
Okay.
And at the same time, ending funding for things they term woke science spending.
Woke science spending. What does that mean in practice, according to the source?
The report quotes a White House spokesperson mentioning ending funds for research linked to divisive racialism and radical gender ideology. It also talks about streamlining or eliminating programs seen as duplicative, DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, or simply unnecessary.
DEI, okay.
There's also a stated goal of achieving American energy dominance.
But you mentioned earlier the report notes cuts in energy research, too.
Yeah, that's one of the apparent contradictions highlighted. Despite that goal, the proposed budget includes significant cuts in certain energy research areas. We can get into those specifics.
Okay, so looking across the board, where are the biggest hits proposed? The report details agency-specific.
Oh, yeah. It goes agency by agency, and the scale is, well, striking, as you said. We're talking potentially deep cuts impacting health research, basic science, environmental monitoring, agriculture, a really wide range.
Let's take health first. NIH National Institutes of Health. What's proposed there?
A 37% cut is proposed for NIH. 37%. That's the main federal agency for biomedical and public health research.
Wow. That would have huge ripple effects, presumably.
Profound implications, yes. For everything from cancer research to Alzheimer's studies to clinical trials, the proposal also reportedly calls for a big reorganization of NIH.
Reorganization, like merging things.
Merging institutes, yeah.
Yeah.
Consolidating many into just 5 new ones. And it specifically mentions eliminating certain centers, the ones for complementary medicine, nursing research, the Fogarty International Center, which handles global health partnerships,
Okay.
and the National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities. The proposal document reportedly characterizes that last one as being replete with DEI expenditures.
Okay. What about the National Science Foundation, NSF? That funds basic research across lots of fields, right?
Right, all the non-medical fields, basically. Physics, chemistry, engineering, social sciences. The proposal detailed in the report suggests cutting NSF by more than half.
More than half. From what to what?
From around $9 billion down to $4 billion.
That's drastic. Where would those cuts fall within NSF?
According to the report, sharp cuts across most research and education programs, specifically targeting areas like climate science, clean energy research, and the social, behavioral, and economic sciences, the SBE Directorate.
But what about AI and quantum? Weren't those priorities?
Those budgets are reportedly held relatively level within NSF, but most other areas face deep cuts. The proposal also apparently guts programs aimed at broadening participation in STEM fields and eliminates the account that funds major research facilities like telescopes or research vessels.
You mentioned climate and environmental research taking hits. NASA, NOAA.
Big time. NASA's science budget could be cut by 53%, according to the report.
53%.
Yeah, with major reductions flagged for Earth science programs, the ones using satellites to monitor climate change. And it proposes terminating huge missions like the Mars Sample Return Project.
Terminating Mars Sample Return. Wow. And NOAA.
NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, faces a proposed 24% cut. The report suggests much of that targets climate-dominated research, potentially wiping out entire research offices or centers.
And the USGS Geological Survey.
Over a third of its budget potentially gone. With its ecosystem mission area, which studies biology, ecology, climate impacts proposed for complete elimination, the focus shifting towards energy and minerals.
It seems like a pattern emerging around climate and ecological science.
Definitely seems to be a target area across multiple agencies in this proposal.
What about other areas, like agriculture, USDA?
USDA faces an 18% overall cut proposed. Within that, the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, NIFA, which funds university research, would see its funding drop by about a third.
Any specific programs mentioned there?
The report says the plan axes specific climate change and renewable energy research programs within USDA. It also trims unrestricted grants to universities, while maybe favoring certain competitive programs or those at historically black colleges and universities, HBCUs.
And the Forest Service. You mentioned that earlier.
Yeah, U.S. Forest Service research faces a really drastic proposed cut, 62%. The proposal document apparently justifies this by saying the current research is out of step with the practical needs of forest management for timber production.
62%. Okay. What about energy research itself? The Department of Energy. You said despite the energy dominance goal.
Right. The DOE's Office of Science, its main basic research arm, faces a proposed 14% cut. And ARPE, which funds high-risk, high-reward energy tech, that would fall by 57%.
ARPAE, down 57%. That seems counterintuitive if you want energy breakthroughs.
It does seem misaligned with that stated goal, yes. Applied energy research programs are also proposed for even deeper cuts across the board at DOE.
And the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency.
Huge proposed cut there, 55% overall. Its Office of Research and Development, or D, looking at nearly 50% reduction.
Which means?
The report suggests severe staff cuts, ending research grants, stopping certain modeling programs. It specifically mentions zeroing out the Atmospheric Protection Program and cutting state environmental grants.
What about public health, like the CDC?
CDC faces cuts, too, with proposals to eliminate specific centers like the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control, the National Center for Chronic Disease Prevention and Health Promotion, and the Center for Global Health.
Elimination, not just cuts.
Elimination is the word used in the report for those specific centers, yes.
Okay, this is a lot. The scale is pretty breathtaking across the board.
It really is. The report details cuts or eliminations proposed for smaller agencies, too, like the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the Marine Mammal Commission. The list goes on.
So how has the scientific community reacted? You said it was strong.
Understandably, yes. Very strong reactions. The report quotes advocacy groups using words like disastrous.
Disastrous for what?
for Americans' health and scientific capabilities, one group said. Another warned it represents a surrender of our leadership role in science and technology globally.
A surrender that helps competitors.
That's the explicit concern raised, that these kinds of cuts would smooth the path for China and other competitors who are, by contrast, investing very heavily in their own science and tech sectors.
Now, the report also mentioned context, right? That proposals like this have happened before.
It did. It notes that proposals for deep cuts to science agencies aren't entirely new, and historically, Congress often, with bipartisan support, has pushed back and resisted such deep cuts.
So this proposal isn't the final word.
Definitely not. It's one step in the long budget and appropriations process. There will be negotiations, debates. It's also not uncommon for budget deadlines to be missed, leading to stopgap funding measures, continuing resolutions, things like that.
But the scale and the specific targets outlined in this proposal, based on our sources, they seem different this time. Unprecedented.
That's the word used in the report. Unprecedented. Both the overall size of the non-defense cut and the depth of the cuts targeted at so many specific science agencies seem to be what's causing such significant alarm this time around.
Which brings us right back to that core tension we started with.
Yeah, the tension between that first argument about the fundamental importance of investing in open research for national strength and competitiveness.
And this specific proposal, detailed in the second source, which calls for doing the opposite, dramatically reducing that investment across huge swaths of science.
Okay.
So, just to recap, we've taken this deep dive into these sources. We looked at a proposed budget that calls for really significant cuts across a vast landscape of U.S. federal science funding.
Pretty much hitting every major agency involved in research.
And we contrasted that with the powerful argument laid out in our other source for why investing in open research is seen as fundamental, key to national strength, competitiveness, staying ahead, especially in really fast-moving fields like AI.
Yeah, it's not just, inside the Beltway budget talk happening somewhere far off. The sources we explored argue pretty clearly that these kinds of decisions, they touch almost everything.
Right, from the pace of tech innovation, the gadgets in your pocket,
To breakthroughs in health and medicine, how we understand and respond to environmental challenges.
and ultimately the nation's ability to compete, to lead on the global stage.
It connects back to that history, doesn't it? That idea from Vannevar Bush that public funding drove decades of U.S. dominance.
Right. So, considering that historical perspective, and then looking at this current proposal with its wide array of targets from basic physics to climate monitoring to biomedical research, it really makes you think.
It does. So maybe the final thought to leave you with is this. Considering everything we've unpacked from these sources, what does this deep dive prompt you to think about the relationship between government investment and the future frontiers of scientific progress, especially in the years ahead?